All right, before we get our hands messy, let me go over some background information for you to keep in your mind while you work with the clay. The first thing you should know is that we're using a high fire clay. This is not like your normal clay that we use in school. That school is student grade, low fire, easier to use. We're gonna use a higher fire clay because it should be more durable as a mug or a piece of functional clay, plates or whatever, bowls. But it is a little bit different color. It's not gonna be the pure white that you're used to from school. And it's gonna have a little bit more grog to it, a little bit more texture inside of it, but I think you'll like it. You're gonna get either a gray piece or a warm brown piece. So I didn't have enough for everybody to have the same, so I kind of just randomly put them in. If you're upset with your color, just let me know, I can swap it out. But the gray is a buff color, it kind of turns out a grayish white, and the brown will turn a warm brown. I can show you some examples. Both of them are going to be nice and durable. Of course, clay is always fragile when it's done, but it's going to be more durable than the student grade clay that we use in school. What you should also know about the clay is that the glazes that we're going to put on top are going to be more neutral colors. So if you're envisioning glazing it later with bright rainbow colors, we're going to have to dial that down because we're using a higher fire clay. The glazes aren't going to get quite as bright, just as the nature that we have, and you'll see some of those color choices later on as you're planning in your mind what you want to do. So keep that in mind. Another thing to think about as you work is how thick your clay should be when you make it. When you roll out a piece of clay or you play with it in your hands or you start to build, you want to remember the rule of pinky. The rule of pinky means that your clay shouldn't be thicker than a pinky width. And we do that for a couple of reasons. Number one, if it's too thin, if I start pressing and squeezing and pinching, it gets to be really floppy and thin, which is great when it's wet, but when it starts to dry out, that becomes brittle and sharp, and it's more likely to break. So we don't want it too thin. If it's too thick, this is a good size, but if I would have a big chunk of clay like this, say here, I'm done, it's not gonna dry out all the way to its core. And it's important that the clay dries out completely to its core before I fire it, otherwise it'll pop in the kiln. Which brings me to my next point. If we are working with clay, we want to avoid air pockets and moisture inside. So if I'm making a piece like this and I fold it in half and squish it on itself, potentially there's air pockets inside of there. And if you think about a kernel of corn inside of it could be some moisture or some air. And when we heat up that kernel of corn, the moisture and the air inside of it expand and eventually pop. And the same thing will happen with your clay when you heat it up in the kiln to about 2,000 degrees. So we really want to make sure before we fire it, I have to let it dry out completely. If it's too thick, we run the risk of it not drying out and the moisture and the air having to get out of the inside of your piece somehow, and it's going to by expanding until there's nowhere for it to go except pop your piece. So make sure it's not too thick. And then the last thing that you need to remember when you work with clay is to score and slip your clay anytime you add two pieces together. So if I was going to put this piece on top of this piece, I'm going to have to score it. And when I say scoring, you have to make some sort of texture marks, and I'll do a close-up of this later. X's, lines, get a fork and scratch it up. Make texture marks on both sides of the pieces. And then before you put it together, we're going to use this cup of slip. It's like a clay smoothie. Don't drink it, it's not good for you. But this cup of slip is just wet clay mixed together with some water. If this spills on you or you run out or it dries out, you can just use water. It's okay. But dip your finger in the wet slurry and you wipe it on your scratch marks that you've made. This is called slip on the score. And we push it together and then we can start to blend it and smooth it by scoring and slipping. I'll show you this close up later, but I need you to remember that we cannot just take two pieces and stick them together. We can't just put one on and smooth it in, and Mrs. Arneson's not here, she won't know that I didn't score and slip, because as it dries, it's going to detach. And if you think about it, if you take your two hands and you push them together really strong, and even though you're smoothing it out and pushing it together, as the clay shrinks, it starts to shift and wiggle. And that shrinkage and shifting is going to make it pop apart. If you score it, you're interlocking your fingers, you're scoring the clay, you're interlocking it, and the slip acts as a glue, and that's going to hold it secure, so as it starts to shrink and shift, it's not going to wiggle apart as easily. So clearly I could rip this apart if I wanted to, but it's going to be more secure along the drawing process and throughout it if I score and slip. So make sure you do that step anytime you attach clay to clay. So those are our background information before we get started. I think you're going to be set to go.